Now, you may have heard some headlines that TikTok is about to be banned in the US.
TikTok's future is hanging in the balance in America.
Today, a House committee voted on a bipartisan bill that could effectively ban the app in the United States.
There are a few steps that need to happen before a TikTok ban does occur, but it is a real possibility after the US House of Representatives passed a bill this week that would force the owner of TikTok to either sell the app or let it be banned in the US.
So, Billy, today we're talking about TikTok, and as you mentioned at the top of the episode, the US House of Representatives has passed a bill that could force TikTok's parent company, they're based in China, to sell the app or face being banned entirely in the US. I'm sure most of our audience is pretty familiar with TikTok, but can you give us a bit of an overview? Who owns it? What's the important detail here that we need?
Yeah, if the audience is like me, they need no introduction to TikTok. I spent way too many hours scrolling that app. But like you said, a lot of people might not know about the owner of TikTok. So TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called Bytedance. And for years, there have been concerns from several countries, including Australia, that data from TikTok is potentially being shared with the Chinese government. And specifically, the concern is that it could be a risk to national security. Like I said, these concerns have been going on for years, and so TikTok, of course, has responded previously. Last year, actually, the TikTok CEO, Shou Zishu, addressed these concerns during a US committee hearing, saying, quote, "TikTok has never shared or received a request to share US user data with the Chinese government, nor would TikTok honor such a request if one were ever made." So they're pretty much outright denying it. Here's a bit more of what he said.
ByteDance is not owned or controlled by the Chinese government. It's a private company. 60% of the company is owned by global institutional investors. 20% is owned by the founder, and 20% owned by employees around the world. ByteDance has 5 board members. 3 of them are American. Now, TikTok itself is not available in mainland China. We're headquartered in Los Angeles and in Singapore.
So like I said, the CEO is very firm on saying there shouldn't be any of these concerns over national security. They say they're a private company and the Chinese government doesn't really have any involvement in their company. And that hearing last year, it was quite feisty at times, with the people in Congress being so certain that these concerns are really valid and the CEO saying they're not.
How can you promise that will move into the United States of America and be protected here?
Congresswoman, I have seen no evidence that the Chinese government has access to that data. They have never asked us. We have not provided.
Well, you know what?
I
find that actually preposterous.
I think maybe we should touch on as well kind of what the lay of the land is when it comes to diplomatic tensions or the relationship between China and Western countries. One of the reasons there is so much concern over this idea of national security, and we'll get to this later, but we have seen a bit of that echoed here in Australia, has to do with the power and dominance of China and its leadership. So the Chinese Communist Party rules China. It is a communist state, but businesses like ByteDance can function independently in China and around the world. However, because of that influence of the Chinese government, it's really hard to know how much a business that is Chinese owned and run has independence versus how much interference there is or pressure there can be from the government. A lot of that is not known, but the fact that we can't definitively say whether or not the Chinese government could access data owned by TikTok is what initially created this concern in the first place at the sort of advent of TikTok becoming what it became.
Exactly. And another thing to point out is that it is not news to anyone, I'm sure, that there is a lot of tension between China and America, also Australia, but let's just focus on China and the US. There is a lot of tension between those two countries, and this is just one way that that tension is manifesting. And also one other thing for context, and then we'll get on to what the actual news is today. But there are about 170 million users in the US alone. That's roughly half of its population. It's absolutely massive.
So we know what happened in March last year. We've heard from the CEO of TikTok himself and how he addressed US leaders. That was pretty much exactly a year ago. So what has happened now? Where are we at in 2024?
So on Wednesday, local time, so it was Thursday in Australia, Wednesday there, the House of Representatives, which is one of the two houses there, passed a bill that would force ByteDance to sell TikTok or to face it being banned.
So just to clarify here, this bill has passed the lower house in the US, which says TikTok or ByteDance has two options.
Yeah.
It can either sell the platform to an owner outside of China, or it will be blocked for US users.
Exactly. And when the lawmakers behind this spoke about it, they really emphasized that they're not wanting to just immediately ban TikTok. That's kind of the last option. Their real goal here is for ByteDance to sell the app to a company outside of China so that it's no longer under their control, again, because they believe that the Chinese government is partly controlling ByteDance. Now, this bill specifically mentions TikTok, but it also says any other social media company that is, quote, controlled by a foreign adversary and has been determined by the president to present a significant threat to national security.
What do you mean by a foreign adversary?
Great question. I also had this because I wasn't exactly sure what they meant by that. So it actually refers to an existing law in the US that lists foreign adversaries as one of 4 countries, and they are North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran.
That's so interesting. I feel like we are often hearing the US talk about national security in terms of those 4 countries, but I never realized that there was actual legislation to describe them as the official foreign adversaries of the US.
Yeah, it really explicitly lays that out.
So this bill has passed the lower house, the House of Representatives. How much support did it receive?
Well, it passed pretty convincingly with a vote of 352 to 65, which I think is really fascinating. I mean, US politics is more divided than ever. So for it to have this massive support from both sides is quite an achievement for the people who made this bill.
It's a very rare show of bipartisanship.
Yes. So that word bipartisan is a word that keeps coming up when you will see the reporting on this. And it means that politicians from both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which are the 2 major parties in the US, were in favor of it. So again, not everyone was in favor of it, but a significant amount across the political aisle. I'll go through what some of them said because it's really interesting. Democrat Raja Krishnamurthy, who was one of the bill's authors, said, again, the bill is not about banning TikTok, but it's about changing who owns it.
Let me tell you about ByteDance. ByteDance is a 100% owner of TikTok. ByteDance is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, the editor-in-chief of ByteDance is the secretary of the Chinese Communist Party cell embedded at the very highest ranks of the company. And he has been charged with making sure that TikTok and all products of ByteDance adhere to, quote, correct political direction. This particular bill ensures that ByteDance divests itself of the vast majority of the ownership of TikTok. Our intention is for TikTok to continue to operate, but not under the control of the Chinese Communist Party.
So some pretty strong points there. Another person we'll hear from is Mike Gallagher, who is from the Republican Party, and he was also one of the lawmakers behind this. And he similarly said that this bill is primarily about mandating that TikTok separate itself from the Chinese Communist Party.
So even though we know that this bill passed with an overwhelming majority in the House of Reps, there were still 65 leaders who voted against it. What do we know about the opposition to this bill? What's been said from the people who aren't in favour of it?
Well, one of the politicians who opposed the bill was Democrat Maxwell Frost. He believes that the bill violates the US Constitution.
I believe that it is an infringement on our First Amendment rights.
Now, Lucy, who is TDA's fact checker, when she was going through our post for this, she actually pointed out that Frost was the first Gen Z person to be elected to US Congress. So that means that he is the youngest person in either the House or the Senate. So basically, he's the young person in the House saying, you know, TikTok is a really important part of a lot of young people's lives, and it's a big part of how a lot of them get communication and get news. I mean, even the Daily Oz, like we have a full-time journalist dedicated to TikTok. So it would really impact young people's way of getting news.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting or telling that the youngest person in Congress, youngest person by a fair chunk, I think worth adding, has spoken out against his own party even on this one.
Yeah. And another vocal critic of this law is Donald Trump. Now, Trump is interesting because he actually called for a ban of TikTok back when he was president in 2020.
I thought I remembered him being Mr. I hate TikTok.
He was absolutely against it, but he has changed his mind. And his reasoning is more because he doesn't want Facebook to become bigger than it already is. He talks about the last election and how Facebook potentially influenced that, and he doesn't want Facebook to get bigger.
There are a lot of users. There's, a lot of good and there's a lot of bad with TikTok. But the thing I don't like is that without TikTok, you can make Facebook bigger. And I consider Facebook to be an enemy of the people, along with a lot of the media.
Okay, so just to recap there, Donald Trump is concerned that if TikTok went away, Facebook would grow.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Billy, what happens now?
So now it's passed the House of Representatives. It now needs to pass the Senate, which is the other house in the Congress. Now, it's not clear what will happen here. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has not confirmed if he will bring the legislation to the floor. Now, that might be confusing because in Australia, if something goes through the House of Representatives, it automatically goes to the Senate. But when I looked further into this, in the US, that's not necessarily how it happens. So his role allows him to actually determine the schedule of the bills in the Senate. So from my understanding, and I learned about this today, he can control whether or not this is put to the floor in the Senate.
I just feel like I have to say something that I'm sure at least one other listener is thinking right now. US democracy is very interesting.
Well, it's certainly different from how we do it here in Australia. But so let's just say that it does go to the floor and it does pass the Senate. Then President Joe Biden has to approve it. And a spokesperson has said that Biden would approve this bill if it comes across his desk. So then that would mean that it becomes law. But even if it does become law, it could still face challenges over whether it complies with the country's constitution, and that would mean that it's a matter for the US Supreme Court, which is the top court in the US, to deal with.
And I guess you have to wonder, if this happens, if this ban passes, surely that kind of changes the game or sets a precedent for other social media platforms or other Chinese-owned businesses. It feels like a can of worms potentially for reform and regulation. I mean, what happens then to other Chinese-owned businesses operating in the US? Have we heard then, Billy, from TikTok more recently? We've heard those grabs earlier in the episode, earlier last year, but what have they said specifically about this bill?
Well, you'll be shocked to hear that they're not very happy. They are really not happy with this bill passing the House of Representatives. The CEO has called it disappointing. Here's some more of what he said in a video that he posted to TikTok.
Over the last few years, we have invested to keep your data safe and our platform free from outside manipulation. This bill gives more power to a handful of other social media companies. It will also take billions of dollars out of the pockets of creators and small businesses. Wow,
it's been a big few months for TikTok. Like I'm thinking about the ban on music after that deal with Universal fell through. So many artists not making the revenue that they were making on the platform. The potential threat of 170 million users falling off the platform in the US if it's banned there. That's the situation in America. But What about here in Australia? Has the government responded to this one at all? Are we going to be banned from using TikTok in Australia?
Well, firstly, to mention, in Australia, TikTok is actually already banned on all federal government devices. So that happened last year, but that doesn't impact the broader population. Like I said, I spend way too long on TikTok every day.
So this ban specifically applies to if you work for government in public service, if you've got a government commissioned device, like if you have a work phone and you work in public service, that device cannot have TikTok.
Yes. And that was also because of national security concerns. But talking about this bill that was passed in the US, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has said that the Australian government has no plans to introduce similar legislation to what happened in the US. So he said, quote, "You always have to have national security concerns front and centre, but you also need to acknowledge that for a whole lot of people, this provides a way of them communicating." But the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, wasn't so convinced that Albanese was doing enough to address these concerns seriously. And here's a bit of what he said about that.
If the intelligence agencies here are informing the Prime Minister that young people online, or millions of Australians who might utilise this platform, if their personal information is being compromised, if it's being hoovered up from their individual messages, if their images are being captured, then that's not a safe place for young people to be. And the Prime Minister needs to explain to the Australian public how he's going to address it and how he proposes to keep people safe online.
So all in all, I think we are going to be hearing a lot more about TikTok, both in Australia and the US, of course. I mean, this is massive news. If it does get banned in the US, that would be absolutely massive.
Yeah, just another quiet day in the news of social media.
Yeah, a lot clearly has happened in the last few weeks for social media.
Bring back MySpace. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you, Billy, for taking us through that very interesting and complicated one. At least we know podcasting is safe for now, touch wood. So share the episode with a friend if you learnt something from today. Make sure you follow The Daily Oz wherever you get your podcasts so that there is an episode of TDA waiting for you every weekday morning. Until then, have a great weekend. We'll chat to you on Monday.